I think we need to begin actually before we start talking about truth and beauty by talking about goodness. Our age is one that sees goods everywhere, but it can't conceive of any one good as having its own integrity, of things being good in themselves. So most people, when confronted with the question of the good, end up just by default answering it for themselves and for others in more or less utilitarian terms. Good gets reducible to a sentiment or a feeling in yourself. When we ask questions about society and our place within it and our pursuit of the good within society, we assume that the language of the common good is some kind of ruse to get us to do something we don't want to do, that the idea of intrinsic goods is simply unintelligible to us, and so we distrust them. And so we look for some kind of social utility to justify the existence of things. Well, that's a destructive way of thinking about goodness for everyone in every single circumstance. There are useful goods. There are some things that are only good because they enable you to attain some further good. But even those goods are only good insofar as we can arrive at an understanding of what's intrinsically good. For the arts, it's as great a disaster as is imaginable, but it's also been kind of a perennial problem in the arts. Here's what I mean by that. If you go back to the ancient world, we have Horace's, on the whole, invaluable Ars Poetica, where he gives us a definition of poetry's aim that has been sort of a theme played with various variations over the subsequent 2,000 years. And that is that poetry is to please and instruct. That is to say, its existence is justified first by its capacity to give you a subjective pleasure, but then also to teach you something about the objective world, usually about moral goodness that stands outside of you. Horace's definition, I think everybody agrees, has much to say for it, and it's very helpful. But it's also an early indication that it's hard for us to envision things as good in themselves. Now, when art gets called good in itself in our day, just the opposite of what Horace says ends up getting affirmed. And that is a kind of decadent aestheticism that says, well, it doesn't have to have anything to do with truth. It doesn't even have to be pleasurable. It just has to have beauty to it. But that's actually an impoverished definition ends up being an impoverished definition of the beautiful. What we need to discover is that things finally are justified in terms of their goodness, including their own intrinsic goodness. We need to recover a sense of the intrinsic good. And when we look at art and literature, we need to recognize that the fine arts are a species of intrinsic good that, like all intrinsic goods, tends to sort of radiate beyond itself. Now, what does that mean? It radiates beyond itself. Well, to speak of intrinsic goods, especially about we have to know something about the human person. Human beings are made for knowing. We're intellectual beings, intellectual animals. The classic term is to call us rational animals, and that's probably the preferable term on balance, but intellectual animals gets at something very important. It gets at the way in which our minds, which go out of themselves through the senses, go out into the world through the senses, and gather things to themselves initially for our own survival and for our own practical use. Those same minds find fulfillment only when they stare at things that are good for their own sake. And that act of staring at the intrinsically good is what we call contemplation. So to call us intellectual animals means that we are the animals that were made for contemplation, to see what is intrinsically good and dwell within it, not to go beyond it, but to dwell within it. Human life then becomes a kind of ladder of ascent, where we go from contemplating intrinsic goods that are lesser to intrinsic goods that are higher, until it culminates in the one act of contemplation that is absolutely inexhaustible, and that is in fact our true destiny, and that's the contemplation of the light of God.